Good evening, and thank you. Welcome to NYU's Skirball Theater, and welcome to the downtown version of the Bush administration's activities that are being discussed uptown now during the Republican convention. I'm Mark Green, the president of the New Democracy Project, and the co-author with Eric Alterman of one of the 5 books that has inspired this panel, the book on Bush, How George W. is Misleading America. And we have also published this month a book for those who want a positive vision of what could come next, a book called What We Stand For, a program for progressive patriotism by Newmarket Press. Let's face it, all political conventions, Democrat or Republican, are exercises in plastic surgery. We, however, have a different medical mission. We are going to hold up a mirror to reality. We are going to engage in substance, not spin, because all our distinguished panel have at least one thing, one trait in common. All have written best-selling books about what Bush has done for or to America and the world. I want to thank first the institutional co-hosts of this evening here at NYU for bringing you all here together tonight. First, People for the American Way, which is hosting what they call the Unemployment Line, a symbolic issue protest Wednesday. And for those of you who want to get involved, you're allowed to go to www.theunemploymentline.org. And let me introduce the beautiful head of People for the American Way, and before the politically correct police put me under arrest, she doubles as my wife, Denny Frand. Also, thank you to The Nation magazine and Katrina Vanden Heuvel, True Majority. True Majority and Ben Cohn and Gary Ferdman, the Progressive Book Club, Elizabeth Wagley, who has just created that. And among the 800 or so of you that are here, allow me to selectively just acknowledge 4 people and save your applause until the end if you so choose. But I want to acknowledge former Assemblyman Frank Barbaro, former president of NYU, John Bradamus, Bob Greenwald, who produced and directed and showed Outfoxed and Uncovered. I knew I should have saved until the end. But last and not least, and I'll say this as politically neutrally as I can since this is a nonpartisan event, my and our good friend Peggy Kerry would all stand up and say hello. Thank you. Each panelist will speak up to 15 minutes and then answer questions submitted on 3x5 cards that you have and will be passed down while I introduce them later. But just in the interest of first things first, please now welcome and wait until I've introduced all, and there'll be more details subsequently. Paul Krugman, who wrote The Great Unraveling, Resist the Temptation. I know it's hard. It's hard for me. Craig Unger, House of Bush, House of Saud, Sidney Blumenthal, The Clinton Wars, and Joe Wilson, The Politics of Truth. Let me kick it off, and this is a high-powered group for such a low technology, but this egg timer is infallible. And when it goes off, the group coercion is amazing. Bill O'Reilly could not shut up Paul Krugman on CNBC, but this can. All presidents, to some extent, have misled, distorted, dissembled, disinformed, fibbed, even lied. When they asked Eisenhower, after he had served as a NATO commander and the head of World War II and Normandy, and of course a two-term president, what he most regretted, he said, quote, "The lie I had to tell about the U-2," close quote, which was not a weather plane, obviously, it was a spy plane over Russia. John Kennedy, according to Robert Dallek's informed biography of him, was not entirely candid about his Addison's disease when he was running in 1960 and thereafter. I don't have to lecture this audience about Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon on Vietnam and Watergate. But George W. Bush is different. He is really historically very, very different. If the breadth and volume of dissembling, to use the metaphor of the moment, were an Olympic event, he would win the gold, the silver, and the bronze. And there wouldn't be any letter afterward complaining about it. Based on our, Eric's and my two-year investigation, we did find a president who day in and day out, on issues large and small, again and again and again, wouldn't tell the truth. Now, we wrote about, and this is pretty easy, Enron's Ken Lay did not endorse Ann Richards for governor in 1994. Source, Ken Lay and Ann Richards. For example, when Bush said that in his self-described great compromise on stem cells, look, we have 60 stem cell lines to investigate when we had 10 stem cell lines available. When he says that the recession began under Clinton, when according to, of course, the economic arbiters of such things, it began under Bush, those were obviously untrue statements. But now, since the book was researched and published, now that nearly all independent authorities, the bipartisan 9/11 panel, the Senate Intelligence Report, you name it, have corroborated the thesis that we are being governed by a serial dissembler. We now know, of course, that the president did get explicit warnings that al-Qaeda planned to hijack airplanes in the United States, not outside, but in the United States. We now know, of course, that there was no collaborative relationship between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. We now know that our troops encountered neither weapons of mass destruction, thank God, nor cheering crowds, unfortunately. We now know, of course, that tax cuts were not greater as a percentage terms for the middle class than the top 1%. In other words, you could go on, but I would ask critics who say, well, they're all alike, Bush is no different. Could you really write a 150,000-word book, much less 12 books, about Truman's dissembling, about Bush 41's dissembling, about Bill Clinton's dissembling, and in terms of volume, not intensity, but volume, forgive me, about Richard Nixon's dissembling. So Bush is actually extremely impressive in his breadth, to the point that he reminds me of something Abraham Lincoln once said of a rival who had such a high regard for the truth that he used it sparingly. How does Bush accomplish this feat in full public view? It's not that easy. First, basically, he and Cheney are the leaders in what magicians understand as misdirection. So they say, now watch my left hand, and the hand behind is doing the tricks. And so the left hand is constant repetition to turn a lie into reality by saying it often enough. And before you think that's circular and ridiculous, how else did 70% of Americans come to think that Saddam Hussein was behind 9/11? Second is just absurdly misleading, but unprovably misleading rhetoric and metaphor. I tell you, I've studied issues like this for a long time. I have never been so sickened as when Condoleezza Rice and then George W. Bush said in late 2002, in the build-up to the war, we got to make sure that the smoking gun doesn't become a mushroom cloud. We meet today 1 mile north of what were the World Trade Towers. We don't need any lecture about how plausibly anxious a city or a country could be because of terrorism. But when you start using images of nuclear catastrophe against someone who didn't have it, couldn't deploy it, and wasn't an imminent threat, you are literally being a President Chicken Little to misdirect and mislead people. Third, then there is certainty replacing accuracy. It is true that friends of mine in the Clinton administration, and I'm told intelligence services abroad, made their best guess that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. But Dick Cheney said, we're absolutely certain he has them, and we know where they are. Now that he's out of his undisclosed location, I saw him on television uptown, he should probably let us know where they are. Then there's ideological arithmetic, something Paul Krugman could write 7 columns a week on if he had the time of the day. And so when the Bush people are criticized for having built up these large deficits, their answer is, well, it's only 3% of GDP, half that of Reagan. Well, that's true if you're not counting the $169 billion they pilfered from the Social Security trust funds, which they said they would not do. And frankly, to compare yourself with deficits to Reagan is like not a Valentine. Finally, there's just pure bunk. I saw Gloria Berger on CNBC interview Dick Cheney, and she said 3 weeks ago, gee, you said that Mohammed Atta, one of the hijackers, met in Prague with Iraqi officials. He said, I never said that for sure. She said, no, you said that. And I watched Dick Cheney go, I never said that. There's this thing called tape. And she then showed the tape of him saying, absolutely confidently, Atta met with Iraqi agents in Prague. This is an imitation of the British aphorism, perhaps wrong, but never in doubt. But some people keep believing it. Whenever I do an interview on this subject, and I'm sure my colleagues are the same, interviewers can't wait to say in their first question, are you calling Bush a liar? Apparently, by the way, I know what the audience, I can hear what the audience thinks, but I have the mic. Apparently, in public life, it's worse to be called a liar than to be one, based on the antagonistic edge in the question. Well, the only honest answer to that question is either he's misleading us or himself, and neither is a pretty answer. We can't know for physical certainty that what he's saying he knows to be untrue. More likely, sadly, is that while most people, certainly most presidents, weigh facts and then it leads to conclusions, President Bush is the exact opposite. He arrives at conclusions which lead to facts. So where do the foregone conclusions come from? Politicians apparently like staying close to their base. However, if any of you can think of one example where George W. Bush has initially broken with the religious right, big energy, and neoconservatives abroad, please email us at thenewdemocracyproject.org, because we couldn't find one example. President Bush and his supporters uptown like to say that he's courageous and strong. I frankly don't think it's terribly strong or courageous to be a dancing puppet to the religious right, big oil, and neoconservatives. The problem is not just a credibility gap. I'll tell you, the strongest Bush supporter, and half the country is split, would have to acknowledge that he sometimes gets things wrong. But the problem is not just a credibility gap. Johnson had a credibility gap. The problem is unbelievably worse. It's a reality gap. Because he won't see the world for what it is, because he sees the world the way his religion tells him to see it, his base tells him to see it, it's as if you're a batter who's blind. And you constantly swing assuming the pitch is on the inside corner, but it's always on the outside corner. You'll never hit. By always misdescribing the way the world is, it leads consistently, not occasionally, to failed policies and a failed presidency. But it's worse than that, to the point that it's not just a failed presidency, it's a radical presidency. You know, the media is going to have to start redefining common words. Radical is no longer a kid with long hair in the 60s. A radical is a short-haired conservative who runs the government saying the following: it is based on American values and history. It is radical to try to privatize Social Security without saying where the $1 trillion you have to pay for it would come from. That's an interesting economic trick. It's radical to invade and occupy a Muslim country, which was no imminent threat to us based on misleading information repeatedly said. It is absolutely radical to treat the Geneva Conventions as an annoyance. With the not unpredictable result of torture, that's the word, it's not abuse, it's torture, and regrettably, probably generations of angry Arab youth as a result. It is absolutely radical to spend $100 billion on a Star Wars system which hasn't worked, can't work, when clearly the nuclear threats to us are with guys with box cutters and guys with handheld rocket launchers aiming at airplanes, which would take $10 billion to protect against, instead of $100 billion for a system that doesn't work. It is fundamentally radical to have a net federal accounts shift from a $5 trillion projected surplus in 2000 rather, to a $5 trillion projected deficit in 2003. A $10 trillion shift in 3 years is not easy to do. It is radical to nearly end environmental law enforcement because your polluting contributors tell you to do it. It is radical to say the jury is still out on global warming. I'm glad they don't let presidents sit on juries. And finally, it is absolutely radical to overturn 800 years of common law and constitutional law and incarcerate people without charges and without access to lawyers. How does he get away with it? Well, a lot of the media, not all the media, but a lot of the media, was so deferential and mesmerized after 9/11 that they couldn't stop repeating the original storyline that he's just a good old boy. A lot of Democrats were mute, paralyzed, facing a president with a then 80% popularity. It's my view that the reason so many books, suddenly, political books, this clock is 5 minutes off. Because of the vacuum left by the media and Democrats, authors writing the truth, holding up a mirror, did even better than they and we deserved because it filled a great vacuum. Finally, Republicans, there's a thing that a Republican congressman once called partyology. We all understand ideology. Partyology is when you so benefit from your party in power, the cufflinks, the visits, the access to money, you're a chairman if you're in the majority, that you don't say what's going on, and you're intellectually dishonest, but politically self-serving. I have an example of that if he says what he's reported to be saying tonight. Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of the city, is speaking at the Republican convention tonight, and he's going to say that George W. Bush is like Winston Churchill. Don't blame the messenger, least of all me. Because, like Churchill, saw the rise of Nazism when no one else would and spoke out against it. As we say in New York, give me a break. Out of power, Churchill, of course, nearly uniquely, saw the rise of Nazism. And then in power, stood up to and defeated one of the greatest threats the world has ever known. George W. Bush, in power, ignored the threat of al-Qaeda, according to Richard Clarke and all the memos, and now, after the attacks, is trying to pretend that he's Winston Churchill by invading the wrong country. Churchill did not invade Bermuda. He responded to the Nazis. So The conclusion of our book, and we'll see what the other panelists say, is that George W. Bush, and I say this not as a matter of partisanship, but empirical reality, really has been a messianic, radical, divisive, and dissembling president. And the people who say that we're pessimists to say it don't understand that when you write books to educate people, you're the ultimate, if naive, optimist in the world, like you who attend tonight. Thank you very much. Paul Krugman, again, is the author of The Great Unraveling, a series of his essays updated in paperback now, his essays in the New York Times and elsewhere. He is, of course, a twice-weekly columnist for the New York Times. He joined them in 1999 on the op-ed page, and he continues as a professor of economics and international affairs at Princeton University. Please welcome Paul Krugman.
Oh boy, wow. Thank you. Does that come off my time? Sorry. Okay. I usually try not to be too emotional when I'm talking about this stuff. And I wasn't counting, but I actually had an emotional experience coming to this event. I came in from central New Jersey, and because something nasty is going on at Penn Station, on top of it, I got off at Newark and took the PATH train in, which it turns out it's quite something. It takes you into the World Trade Center, and it actually takes you around. You get a view of the pit at Ground Zero, and then you walk through the station, which has got all of the a lot of memorial stuff and a lot of history and so on. It's quite something. It's quite moving, and of course, what I suspect most people in this room would feel going through it is not just, of course, to be moved and to remember, but also quite a lot of rage, rage at the exploitation of this atrocity for partisan ends. If we ever come out the end of this tunnel, we will look back and say that some of what's happened over the last 3 years has been among the most shameful episodes in our history. This audience has probably not got a whole lot of people I need to convince that the Bush administration is doing a bad job. So I thought I would try to talk a little bit about where we stand and possibly what can be done. Let me say first off that just this whole business of the Bush, the books about Bush, and books about the administration have been a sort of reverse of the parable of the blind man and the elephant. In this case, each author has grabbed hold of a different piece of the beast, something that they knew about. So for me, economics; for Joe Wilson, national security; for Molly Ivins, sort of ground-level reporting; for Sid Blumenthal, how the whole apparatus works; for Craig Unger, the relationship with the Saudis. Each of us have gotten hold of a piece that we understood pretty well, and gotten a picture of what the beast is like from that piece, and we've all been right. It turns out that each piece gives you a picture of the whole. Whatever your field is, you get the sense that there's something really wrong here, that there's something very deeply dishonest, irresponsible, and that there's a hidden agenda. In my own case, it's funny that where I came in, the point at which I realized prematurely, because it's not acceptable to have realized what was going on until much later. But the point when I realized that there was something really wrong was actually during the 2000 campaign, and it was over the issue of Social Security privatization, which it actually took me a while. I've expunged from the book some of my early attempts where I was actually desperately trying to find out some way in which this thing made sense, what candidate Bush was saying, and finally realized that it was a scam, pure and simple, that it really was 2 minus 1 equals 4, that he was saying something that's complete nonsense. it's amazing that if the reports are correct, that on Thursday night he's going to try the whole thing exactly as before. That having run on it, having had his own commission, unable to come up with a plan because, the arithmetic just doesn't work, he's nonetheless going to try it once again and say, here's the magic solution that will solve, actually in the case of Social Security, solve a problem that doesn't exist. But anyway, that we're going to create this great plan. It's an amazing thing. It turned out that's the story all through. That what I saw in Social Security, what I saw on fiscal policy, is also the story on science policy, environmental policy, and of course, in the end, national security and the war. A couple of things to say. One thing that I think is important, and it's not a criticism of Green and Alterman, but it's along the lines, focusing on the gotcha lies is worthwhile, but you shouldn't focus on it too much. Because often the worst things are when they don't literally lie. If you go through the economic statements, you can find, if you want to find a situation where Bush said, most of our tax cuts go to people at the middle or the bottom of the economic spectrum, you can find that, but you have to sift through mounds and mounds of Bush statements. Most of the time, what he and his people say are things that convey that impression without actually saying it. So that in last year, and as you can find it again in the campaign materials, last year saying that 92 million Americans will get an average tax cut of $1,000, which conveys the impression, and actually you would find that some pundits actually said, well, every family is going to get $1,000, so that's really good. And of course, the answer, right? It's people don't know what average means. If Bill Gates walks into a bar, the average net worth of the patrons is a couple of $1 billion. But the point about, and that is of course exactly how it works, but the point about that is that when they say something that is deliberately misleading, but not literally, that is misleading, let me say, but not literally false, that actually shows that it's deliberate. That if the extreme care, try to find, I don't think anybody has found a statement in which Bush said that Saddam was responsible for 9/11. But you can find hundreds of elusive sentences where 9/11, Saddam, all are kind of blurred together, which shows that he and his speechwriters knew that it wasn't true and were trying to plant the idea in people's minds. And that's the thing that's worst. It's not the gotcha moment. It's not the smoking gun of the sentence where he says something that's falsifiable. It's the sentences that were clearly, carefully crafted to convince people of something that the administration knew was not true. Bush. We also probably make a mistake if we make too much emphasis on Bush, the individual. I mean, I know that there's a particular thing that can drive you wild, which is the ascription of all of these virtues to a man who manifestly does not possess them. Right? The idea that this guy of all guys is treated as a heroic figure is really baffling. But this really isn't about Bush. Bush is the guy that the movement found to take them over the top. But it didn't start with him, and it won't end with him either. What's going on in this country is that a radical movement, I think we really do, Mark is entirely right, and radical is the right word, a radical movement that has been building for several decades finally found their moment and their man in Bush. But you shouldn't think of it as just being him. There's a complete continuity between what's going on now and the campaign of slander and innuendo against Bill Clinton. There's complete continuity going back. Really, I think. But this is my next book. You really need to go back to Goldwater. A lot of this has its roots actually in civil rights, and the people who don't like them. So it really. But you really have to understand that this is not about one guy. It's not even about one dynasty, although that's a story in itself. It's about the coalition between the the malefactors of great wealth, and the religious right, and how they got, how they found their man. So don't think of it as just being about this one guy. How can they get away with it? This is one of the biggest stories, I think, and you may want to know what does the Times think about what I write. By and large, they're extremely protective, but they do get antsy when I talk about the media, because they're part of it, because it's sort of. But it's not possible to deny that the media are a very central part of this. Actually. If you can get hold of it, the American Journalism Review has an interview with Warren Strobel and Jonathan Landay, the two Knight Ridder reporters who, during the build-up to the war, were providing by far the best account. I mean, I was going back and saying, why did I know that the case for an active Iraqi nuclear program was being cooked up? Why did I know that this was being sold, that analysts were being pressured? All the stuff that many people still won't admit, but that been treated as a revelation. I think it was actually because I was reading the Knight Ridder stories above all. And they say, in talking about it, that the story of media failure here is as important as the story of intelligence failure. It is central to it. A couple of things to say on that. One is, of course, that substantial chunks of the media are part of this same movement. With Robert Greenwald here, we don't need to say much more about that. Yes, Fox News and the Washington Times and all of that are part of it. The rest is very difficult. Most of the media, I'm not sure if that's still true. I've been watching the sad decline of CNN, but anyway, most of the media is still trying to be even-handed. Is still mainstream, but they have lost the sense of what it means, what the job of being an even-handed media really is. It's not it should be, well, okay, here's what people are saying, and we have checked the facts, and here's what the truth is. Instead, it has become, here's what one side says, here's what the other side says, we report, you decide. As another one of my people who've heard me before will recognize lines, but if Bush said that the Earth was flat, the headlines on a lot of the mainstream media stories would be shape of the Earth. Views differ. And I saw that. I saw that in 2000 over Social Security. I couldn't believe it was happening, that I could not get anyone at my organization or any other to write a straight story saying, what does it take to privatize Social Security? It was always, here's what Bush says, here's what the other side says, and sounds good, he's promising great stuff. You can find it more recently on employment reports. You can find lots of issues, many issues. Swift boats, of course, the most horrible of them. But in this case, the last jobs report was really crummy. It was crummy enough so that if you were watching CNBC, which had this at 8:30 in the morning when they had the traders in the Chicago pit, when the number came out, the traders started chanting, Kerry, Kerry, Kerry. But to read all the newspaper stories the next day, it was, well, the Bush people say it's a good number, it's a good report, and the other side said it's a bad report, and you would never have known the difference. All right, what do we do? It is really it's much bigger than Bush. It's a movement, it's been building. The one thing I think you really have to say is that people, can I say on the left, the position formerly known as the center, people like myself, people like myself have been asleep for a long time. We didn't take it seriously. We sat through all the Clinton scandals and said, oh, probably funny stuff going on there. Didn't really understand the extent to which this movement was being built, which says I have 1 minute, I believe. In the long run, there has to be the creation of institutions. My great beef with Bill Clinton, who I thought did a terrific job in the office, but he did not build the institutional basis for rolling this thing back. That's in the long run. How are we ever going to get time to do that, given that this onslaught is there and it will come? They're getting rid of one man is not in itself It's necessary but not sufficient, as we say in the economy. The answer, I think, my great hope now is what we need is an enormous unearthing of the scandals that we know have taken place. We need a mega Watergate that rocks them back for enough time so that we can build a counterweight to this thing. Otherwise, this won't be the country we grew up in. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Those of you who want to write questions can do so at any time, and a couple of people, if you could, just walk down the aisle looking for cards, which will be passed up. And if you'd like to put your name on the question, that's invited but not required. The next speaker is Craig Unger, who is the author of the best-selling House of Bush, House of Sod. He was the deputy editor at the New York Observer and editor-in-chief of Boston Magazine. Craig has written about George Herbert Walker Bush and George W. Bush for The New Yorker, Esquire, and Vanity Fair. His work is featured in Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 9/11. He appears frequently as an analyst on terrorism and Saudi-American relations and the oil industry on a whole series of radio networks and cable channels. Please welcome Craig Unger.
Thank you. My family and I actually have a long relationship with the Bushes. My father went to Yale with George H.W. Bush. Our families both moved from the East Coast to Texas about 50 years ago. In 1959, I attended Camp Longhorn with George W. Bush. That summer in the election he never talks about, both George Bush and I were elected Campfire Lighter of the Week. And finally, in around 1971, just after I graduated college and I looked at my first apartment off campus, I found a place in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and as I entered it, there was a floor-to-ceiling poster of George H.W. Bush, and I was renting the apartment of this guy who was about to graduate from Harvard Business School. But that's all I have in common with him. This book came to me very much out of 9/11. I did have a history covering George Bush Sr. in Iran-Contra and Iraq-Gate in 1991. And September 11th was not just horrifying to me as an event, I was also horrified by the way the media covered it, or rather it didn't cover it. Even the New York Times put out a book on the subject called Out of the Blue. And 9/11, as I think we know now, did not come out of the blue. It was the product of a series of relationships and events that had been building for many, many years. In covering Bush Sr., I was very much aware of his relationship with the Saudis. He'd been very, very close friends with Prince Bandar for many years. They had business relationships together. And Prince Bandar had played a key role in Iran-Contra. He had put his own money in, the Saudis had no relationship with Nicaragua, yet Prince Bandar actually put his own money in Swiss banks to help get around a congressional amendment that was passed unanimously, known as the Boland Amendment, to stop Iran-Contra back in those days. So I began looking into it right after 9/11, and I began Googling like crazy, and I came across the Carlyle Group. And as I began to look into it, some astonishing things started to come up. I saw a number of Saudis in it. I started looking at the relationship, and one of the things that became very, very clear to me, and it seemed to me this was the elephant in the living room that I was looking at, that no one else in the press seemed to be asking the questions about this. How could we wage a real war on terror if the President of the United States and his family had such close business relationships with Saudis, some of whom were actually accused of funding terrorism? And that was a question no one seemed to be asking. I started looking all over the internet for this, and I started saving it to my hard disk, and then I remember the last time I saved it was September 23rd, 2001, and a few days later, the Carlyle Group website went down, and when it came back up, there were no Saudis on it. And so that's when I really decided to get serious about this and start looking into it. That relationship is an extraordinary relationship, and to put it in context, I mean, it might be, I'm not sure it's fair to compare it to something like Whitewater, but that was a scandal, and I'm using the word in quotes, in which the Clintons actually lost money. They lost $65,000. By contrast, the Bushes and their allies have 20,000 times as much money coming from the Saudis to them. I found a total of $1.4 billion in investments and contracts going from the Saudis, from the Royal House of Saud, to companies in which the Bushes and their allies, I'm talking about Dick Cheney, have major positions. The three major companies I'm talking about are Halliburton, Harken Energy, and of course the Carlyle Group. This is a figure that, if any of you, many of you may have seen 9/11, Fahrenheit 9/11, and that figure is used there. It's finally being challenged. No one bothered to challenge it until it came out in the movie. I guess now it's a high enough profile target. But the criticism of it that comes out, and this is a way the right and the media sometimes spin it, is they say, well, George Bush Sr. didn't join the Carlyle Asian Fund until 1998. That's true, and I report that in my book. What they selectively omit in this criticism is that George W. Bush joined the Carlyle Group 8 years earlier in October of 1990. And in 1993, after the end of the Bush-Quayle administration, James Baker, Richard Darman, Frank Carlucci all joined the Carlyle Group. Bush Sr. began giving speeches for them, going to Saudi Arabia, raising investment money. And so this relationship began a total of $1.4 billion. The real question that raises is what did the Saudis get in return? And I'm not alleging, and it's sometimes criticized as this wild conspiracy theory. I'm not really alleging such a major conspiracy theory. What I'm saying is they had close working relationships. They had close business relationships. Prince Bandar was a very, and still is a very, very close personal friend of the Bush family. He drops by in Kennebunkport, Maine. He drops by in Crawford, Texas. There are photos of him cooking up a storm in the kitchen in Kennebunkport. He's the only one who's allowed to smoke cigars, or anything for that matter, in the Bush household. Barbara Bush lets him. He's known as Bandar Bush. If you look at the photos of him hanging out with George W. Bush, this is not a man standing in awe of the President of the United States. He's lounging around with his good friend's son, and that is the kind of relationship they have. So I wanted to take that to September 13th, 2001, and to see what the Saudis get in return, and how this administration waged its so-called war on terrorism. And if you look at a lot of the events leading up to it, we see again and again the Bush administration ignoring signs of the building terrorist threat their first year. And I think to give them the benefit of the doubt, reasonable people could argue that, look, a new president has a lot on his radar screen, even on August 6th, when he's given a memo that says bin Laden to attack. Well, who knows? He's got a lot of other things on his plate, as he was in Crawford, Texas that day, and he was bass fishing. But on September 13th, 2 days after 9/11, there's no excuse for terrorism not to be the first thing on his mind, for the war on terrorism. And at that time, he knew, of course, that 15 out of 19 of the hijackers were Saudis. He knew that Osama bin Laden was behind it. He knew that that Al-Qaeda was largely Saudi in origin, that its financing, its infrastructure was backed by members of the Saudi royal family, by the Islamist charities. And Prince Bandar came to the White House that day. And this is where the president should have said, we need transparency. in the Islamist charities that are funding it. We need transparency in the Saudi royal family members who are doing it. But instead, that day, the planes began flying back, and at 4:30 in the afternoon, the first plane with 3 Saudis on it left Tampa, Florida, to Lexington, Kentucky. This again is a point of contention that you'll see in the 9/11 Commission report. And I think it's worth looking. I think there's a lot of valuable information in the 9/11 Commission report. But it's also the report of a commission that is bipartisan and whose mandate was to come up with a consensus. And as a result, I think they selectively omitted information and facts that were divisive, and some of which were potentially explosive. So, though I don't find any facts that are in it that are actually wrong, what is interesting is what they don't have in it. And it is true that on that day, commercial aviation began again. But what they omit is that at 10:57 a.m. on that day, private aviation was once again all banned. It had banned earlier. The Federal Aviation Administration sent out a new memo, a new notice to pilots saying that all private aviation was banned. 3 planes violated that ban in the United States and were forced down. Yet the flight from Tampa to Lexington started. It needed White House approval, and it got White House approval. And that is just one of the many actions done by the Bush White House that shows a certain lack of waging a real war on terrorism. To take another one, they started a program called Visa Express. And they made Saudi Arabia, this was before 9/11, the only country in the world where if you needed a visa, you didn't even really have to go down to the consulate. You could send a third party to do it. 3 of the hijackers used that program. And what it was even more remarkable is after 9/11, they didn't bother to shut it down immediately. They let it go again and again. So I think repeatedly we've seen this attitude, this lax attitude towards Saudi Arabia. And it just, as a result, when you're, I happen to live 5 blocks from Ground Zero, and to see President Bush lauded as our great hero in the war on terror, it can be a bit hard to take. I think it's also worth looking at what's coming out of this. And in many ways, I think President Bush has left us with the worst of both worlds. And by that I mean that it would be one thing if the American people were getting a lot out of this relationship with Saudi Arabia. And I think one of the great tragic ironies that seems to be coming out of this is that, oddly enough, this administration, which is dominated by oil executives, is leaving us with more tenuous ties to Middle East oil than ever before. And that I think we've all seen the price of gas go up in the last year. But if you think about it, where we are today, and I think it really is worth reading some of the neoconservative tracts that are on the internet from the Project of New American Century. There's a new one out called World War IV, and that seems to be the guidepost set out by James Woolsey and Norman Podhoretz and so on. We're entering a world in which, like it or not, we've had to deal with the devil with Saudi Arabia, and we're a nation with 165 million automobiles. And as the price of gas goes up, this economy is going to get in worse and worse shape. And where are we now? Well, Saudi Arabia is in a state of civil unrest like never before. It's whether, even if the House of Saud survives for several years, there's going to be a succession crisis there. No moderate leader in the Arab world can possibly be friendly with the United States now. Even before 9/11, this relationship was wearing thin because of Bush's positions, and Crown Prince Abdullah had written him a 28-page letter saying our relationship is about over. In Iraq now, you have enormous instability. The war is increasingly becoming a war on oil facilities. Cheney had predicted that we'd be getting 3 million barrels of oil a day out of Saudi Arabia. It's less than 1 million, and with the attacks yesterday virtually coming to a halt. So the question is, where are we going now, and are we entering a new era of oil wars? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Craig. Sidney Blumenthal is the author of the best-selling The Clinton Wars, about the term of Bill Clinton and the right-wing assault on him. And he knows about it because he served as an assistant to and senior advisor to President Clinton from August 1997 until January 2001. I thought he was sort of the Arthur Schlesinger Jr. of the administration. I say that's as high a praise as I can come up with. He was someone who is an intellectual, a historian, but a politician. And he'd known the Clinton for years before then. But he was there also because for years before then, he had been a prolific and prominent author in the New Republic, the Washington Post, and then served, I think, as the Washington bureau chief, or the equivalent of the New Yorker, before serving President Clinton. He now is the Washington bureau chief of Salon, the online magazine. Please welcome Sidney Blumenthal.
Thank you, Mark. I'm delighted to be here with my old friend Mark, and honored to be here with Paul and one of my oldest friends, Craig, and with Joe, who I served with in the Clinton White House. And I'm delighted that Mark has convened this first meeting of the New York Subway Veterans for Truth. Well, I've been watching those other veterans, not the ones who stood with John Kerry at the Democratic Convention, but those on that commercial. And it's inspired me to address this in a concentrated way, a focused way here. The most insidious of the lies about John Kerry is that it's his fault. It's that somehow he brought this on himself because he spoke about the fact that he was a war hero. And by drawing attention to his war heroism, which, by the way, is essential in his talking about his defense policy, foreign policy, and how he would conduct a war on terrorism and an aggressive, effective foreign policy. Somebody who served for 18 years in the Senate, on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and has a deep and profound history of foreign relations, that all this was his fault, that he did this to himself. Somehow I didn't think this was an aberrant incident, random, some kind of incoherent happenstance or sudden, but something that was the result of a systematic campaign. It was long in coming. It was a method that has been well perfected in Republican campaigning. And it has been essential to the rise in power of George W. Bush, and a method of which Karl Rove is a particular practitioner. But this is not simply about negative campaigning, nor is it about the common media canard, if I can cite a duck here, that they all do it. This goes to more profound questions. It goes to the question of the twisting of U.S. intelligence, the intimidation of our fundamental institutions of American government, from the Department of Justice to the CIA, to the lies about WMD, that Saddam was in league with al-Qaeda. And this week, as Bush said, that the problem with the failures of his non-strategy in Iraq since the war is catastrophic success. In other words, our military succeeded so brilliantly that Bush's strategy failed. So it is the military that is at fault and not Bush. And now, tonight, while we're seated here, Rudy Giuliani is rehearsing his speech to depict George W. Bush as the modern Churchill. This is a focused, disciplined message on the part of the Republicans in their convention, which you will hear every night, that Bush is a decisive, strong leader who is indispensable in protecting your safety, and that he is the Churchill for our times. You will hear it every single night. All this is starkly familiar to me. The night before I joined the Clinton White House as assistant to the president, I turned on my computer screen and I happened to surf by Matt Drudge's website, where I noticed a headline saying that I had a secret history of domestic abuse and was hiding police records about it. Well, you know, the first time I looked at it, it struck me just like those who laughed at it. I thought it was something like an old Borscht Belt joke. You know, when have you stopped beating your wife lately? I called my wife and asked her to look at this, and her first reaction was to literally to look behind the computer screen. And she said, did one of your friends put this in here as a joke? And what I learned was that no matter how absurd and obviously false a lie can be, and a lie is, people will believe it. Even some of our closest friends inquired, isn't there something there? Are there some records? You know, where there's smoke, there's fire. Are you sure? This has an insidious effect. Now, I knew about this before because I had sat with my friend Hillary Clinton when she was subjected to news articles which said that, which were leaks from the Ken Starr's office saying she was about to be indicted in Whitewater. Total falsehoods. I had sat with President Clinton. We were working on his second inaugural address, and he told me the story of his conversation with Senator Alan Simpson, where he said to Simpson, Alan, you know this Whitewater stuff is nonsense, that there's nothing there, that Hillary and I didn't do anything. And Simpson said, sure, we all know that. It just got out of hand. Now, why do they do it? They do it because it works. It works to destroy the effectiveness of people they disagree with, to destroy any alternative positive message, and to destroy progress itself. They actually don't want the changes. And it works to warp, distort, and direct a political debate for their benefit. It succeeds and has succeeded in manipulating and intimidating large parts of the press corps, which has seen its standards and professionalism undermined. Even the most professional and stable parts of the mainstream press have retreated into a false objectivity where the lies become a matter of on the one hand, on the other hand. I wish I had a patent on the one hand. On the one hand is the lie. On the other hand is the truth. You decide. And so on CNN, for example, for a week, they were presenting the story. On the one hand, here's the lie, but not presented as the lie. is just an opinion, and then the truth, just another opinion. There's no adjudication of fact. There's a complete abdication of responsibility when this takes place. Now, I saw this in the Clinton experience, and I recall lots of people saying to me, you know, the Clintons must have done something. They must have brought it on themselves. There had to be something there in Whitewater. Why would it happen? Now, the person who really explained why Whitewater happened, and as Craig Unger pointed out, it was an investment in a land deal in which the Clintons lost money. They were subjected to a $75 million independent counsel investigation, which determined in the end that they were innocent, as other official investigations had. It was Rush Limbaugh who was the ultimate truth teller. And Limbaugh said, Whitewater is about health care. That's why it was done, because it worked to prevent the Clinton health care initiative from being passed. It was the creation of a pseudo-scandal. They wanted to obscure this and to create political trouble. And it was a very important element in succeeding in killing health care, and why today more than 40 million Americans are uninsured. So we saw this with the creation of many pseudo-scandals. Who can forget the travel office scandal? That Vince Foster was killed by the Clintons, their close friend. The FBI file scandal, campaign finance. Now, here's an interesting fact about campaign finance in which not a single official of the Clinton administration was indicted or convicted of anything. There were more than 1,000 FBI agents assigned by Louis Freeh, the FBI director, to investigate campaign finance. More than 4 times more the number of FBI agents ever assigned to investigate the terrorism in the first World Trade Center bombing. All politically driven. And then, of course, we had the unconstitutional impeachment. This was followed then by the smearing of Al Gore. Now, Gore was an Eagle Scout who was successfully tarred as a liar and exaggerator. And, of course, the lies were all about him. Gore was tarred because he stood in the spotlight. It was his turn. The spotlight shifted to him. He was the one who was going to be next. That's how he brought it about himself, brought it on himself. And now it's John Kerry's turn. First I saw an intern scandal on Matt Drudge that turned out to be completely fabricated. And now the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth. Where have we seen this before? Somehow I remember that Ann Richards, when she was governor of Texas and running against George W. Bush, that there were terrible rumors that somehow she was a lesbian. And she didn't want to talk about it. And she was badgered by a press corps that somehow was prodded to ask her in public about this. And then a Republican state senator who just so happened to be a Bush coordinator in East Texas, in public, made an accusation against her, which then allowed the press to report this. And then there was an independent group, and so on and so forth. And then I remembered John McCain in the 2000 primaries, with all sorts of independent groups spreading rumors about him. And spreading stories in the South Carolina primary that he had adopted a black baby. In fact, he and his wife had adopted a young East Asian girl, and that he had lied about his military record. Bush then emerges as somebody who says that he is against all this negative campaigning. He is above it all. And I have one more minute. So it all struck me as very familiar. And what is the ultimate issue here? The ultimate issue is an issue of democracy. It's an issue It's really about, it's about us. Let me just finish in 60 seconds. Reading from just a few paragraphs from a column I've written. It's about what's been going on at Bush rallies. Before attending a rally to hear Vice President Dick Cheney, citizens in New Mexico were required to sign a political loyalty oath approved by the Republican National Committee. I, full name, do hereby endorse George W. Bush, and this is how it actually read, for re-election of the United States. Now, Bush is campaigning at events billed as Ask President Bush. Only supporters are allowed in. Talking points are distributed to questioners. In Traverse City, Michigan, it's a dangerous spot, a 55-year-old social studies teacher who wore a carry sticker had her ticket torn up at the door. How can anyone in the United States deny someone entry, she asked. Isn't this a democracy? Well, floundering in the polls, without a strategy for Iraq, unwilling to say the name of bin Laden, George W. Bush is secure in the knowledge that the cheering multitudes before him have been pre-selected. Ask President Bush has crystallized the underlying issue, and you will see it all week as the Republicans stay on message about our Churchill. And that issue was framed succinctly by the greatest American poet of democracy, who happened to live for many years in this city, Walt Whitman, who wrote, "The president is there in the White House for you. It is not you who are here for him." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sidney. Anyone has any final questions, could people walk up and down to get cards and then pass them along during the final remarks. The concluding speaker before the Q&A is Ambassador Joseph Wilson. Ambassador Wilson is the author of the best-selling The Politics of Truth and was a career United States diplomat from 1976 to 1998. He was called by President George Herbert Walker Bush a, quote, true American hero, close quote, for his work on international affairs for over 20 years and was the last American official to see Saddam Hussein before the first Gulf War. And of course, most prominently in February of 2003, he investigated reports of Iraq's attempts to buy enriched uranium from Niger. And when he was surprised that the president repeated a claim he had thought he had debunked in the 2003 State of the Union address, wrote a now famous op-ed in the New York Times saying this was emblematic of the Bush exaggeration making the argument for our case for invading Iraq, about which I'm sure he will now speak. Please welcome Ambassador Joe Wilson.
Thank you. This is eating into my time. Thank you. Or as I like to say, Bob Novak, eat your heart out. Now, if we get too frisky, I might just say somebody ought to be frog-marched out of the White House again. So I don't want to do that. After all, that, as my wife said, you got a little bit ahead of yourself in that. But I'm delighted to be here, Mark. Thank you very much for inviting me to my colleagues, Paul Krugman, who has written so eloquently for so long on this particular subject twice a week in the New York Times. Thank you for your service to American democracy. To Craig, whose book is a real revelation and enhances our understanding of the nature of this relationship. Thank you. And to my friend Sid and his wife Jackie Blumenthal, who have been pillars of strength to Valerie and myself as the latest smear campaign has swirled around us. It has been the Blumenthals who have come to us and have held our hands and have said, remember, one of the things that always happens when it's spinning around you is you have a tendency to forget that you're just innocent. So remember, you are innocent in all this. I thank you. Since I only have 15 minutes about a subject, to talk about a subject where I could wax eloquent live for several hours, I'm going to assume that everybody has read the book and talk really about the chapter that is still being written. In fact, there are two chapters that are still being written. The first one, which I'll talk about today, is the anatomy of a smear campaign. The second one is redemption, and I am absolutely persuaded that we will have redemption in this, thanks to Pat Fitzgerald and others. As some of you who may read the Wall Street Journal and Bill Safire and other right-wing reporters may have noticed at the publication of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report, there was a whole section on the Niger caper. And there were some conclusions that the Senate came to which were simply incorrect. I want to address that. And there were some conclusions in the additional views by the senators, three senators, Mr. Bond, Mr. Hatch, and Mr. Roberts, relating to Valerie and myself. I want to address just two parts of these, and the rest of them I'll address in the Q&A session if I get a question. First is the assertion that the President was correct in making the statement in the State of the Union address in January of 2003 that the British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently attempted to acquire significant quantities of uranium from Africa. Now, as a consequence of that statement being in the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report, I have been branded a liar, and I think some of the ditto heads, including my friend Sean Hannity, a traitor, for having lied and somehow impugned the integrity of the President of the United States for having suggested that he should not have said those 16 words. And yet, if you go back and you look at the body of the report, and regrettably, a rather docile American press decided that they couldn't take the time to read the 7 pages on this particular matter to determine themselves what precisely the Senate had concluded and come up with in terms of information. But if you do that, pages 52 to 59, at least as I downloaded it, of the report, you might in fact see that on October 2nd of 2002, nearly 4 months before the President's State of the Union address, the Deputy Director of Central Intelligence testified to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the same committee that did this report. Now, the Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, in testifying to the Senate committee, was speaking as the spokesman for the American intelligence community, offering the corporate view of American intelligence, not whether one analyst was somehow reinforced by Wilson's report, the corporate view of American intelligence, almost 4 months before the State of the Union address, and what he said was one area where we believe the British have stretched the information is on uranium sales from Africa to Iraq. Now, those of you who don't live in our little world, our little national security world, might want a translation of that sentence. It basically, what he said, representing the American intelligence corporate view, we think the British are full of crap on this one. 4 months before the State of the Union address. 4 days later, the Director of Central Intelligence, again, offering the corporate view of American intelligence, called the Deputy National Security Advisor, and he said to him, "We do not want the President to be a witness of fact on this matter, because the reporting is weak, translation, the case has not been made, and because we have told Congress that we believe the British have exaggerated the case. Again, the British are full of crap on this one. The Director of Central Intelligence also sent 2 faxes to the White House, to the National Security Advisor and her deputy on this matter. And yet, 4 months later, the President of the United States used this assertion in his speech. Now, the day after my modest little piece appeared in the New York Times, and I remind people that for all the talk about this, it was 1,500 words entitled What I Did Not Find in Africa. This was not 7,000 pages of secret documents. In fact, the first attempt to smear me said maybe he was revealing secrets. Let me remind people, nothing. What I did not find in Africa. The day after that article appeared, the White House spokesman came out and he said to the Washington Post, the 16 words did not merit inclusion, did not rise to the level of inclusion in the State of the Union address. A week later, George Tenet testified to the Senate in which he said what I just said earlier. He said to the Senate that, yeah, he did not want the President to be a witness of fact. A couple of days after that, the National Security Advisor and her deputy looked through their files, and they found these 2 faxes and this record of the telephone call. The Deputy National Security Advisor offered his resignation, and the National Security Advisor said, we forgot. And yet, when the Senate Select Committee report comes up with this conclusion, and it's interpreted by people, it's interpreted as, well, Bush was okay. It was right for him to say that. Which basically what they're saying to you is it's okay to outsource American intelligence and analysis to the British, even though the British only spend 5% of what we spend on intelligence, even though the British have very limited assets in Africa. And I served in Africa for 23 years. The first thing a British diplomat does when they circuit ride to countries like Niger, where they have no presence, is drop in to see their American counterpart to find out what the hell's going on. The second assertion, of course, in this report is that somehow my wife had some role to play in my being sent out to Niger. And yet the body of the report establishes my bona fides. In addition to 23 years doing Africa, including at the White House where I worked intimately with a succession of Niger governments as they worked through 2 military coups and the assassination of a president in order to help them get back to a democratic system of governance. In addition to that, the report says Wilson went out on behalf of the CIA to ask other uranium-related questions in 1999. Those are my bona fides. Now, I would never have told you that. And I'm sorry the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence decided to do so, because in so doing, they burned and compromised a number of my business contacts. And if they could do it to me, they could do it to other Americans who, at the request of their government, go out and try and ferret out information that's important to our understanding of what potential enemies may have in mind for us. And remember, when I took this trip, it was several months. When I took the trip in 2002, it was months before I had ever formulated a position on the war. And indeed, when I did formulate a position on the war, it was based upon a legitimate concern about the threat to our national security posed by weapons of mass destruction. I was asked, because I knew something about Niger, a lot about Niger. I was asked because I had undertaken a mission before, and I undertook that mission because nuclear weapons kill Americans. They don't kill just Democrats or Republicans. They would kill Americans if they went off. National security doesn't mean Republican or Democratic security. It means American security. So for these guys to try and paint me as a partisan in this is unfair. For them to, on the one hand, on July 14th of 2003, betray the national security and betray my wife's identity, and a year later try and smear her by suggesting that somehow she was responsible for something that she was not responsible for, is really piling on and a disgrace, and they should be ashamed of themselves. Now again, a docile press, There was an article in the Washington Post that said, that quoted a phrase from my book where I said, she had nothing to do with my trip. Left out of that quote was the beginning of the sentence which said, other than serve as a conduit. Doesn't that change the meaning? Isn't that a professional faux pas, as they say in French? Yes, indeed it is, but that has become the primary source material for everybody else. Nobody's bothered to go back and look at the book, just as nobody's bothered to go and read the text of the Senate report. And as a consequence, my wife's name, which never should have been known to anybody, has been dragged through the mud, her identity's been betrayed, her reputation's been besmirched by this, while the person who put the 16 words in the President's State of the Union address remains unknown to anybody. Now, why did they do this? Why did they do this smear campaign? Well, there's a number of reasons. One, I suspect the neoconservatives were not very happy when I wrote about them that they are a parasite loyal only unto themselves who found the Republican Party a willing host. I think Mr. Gillespie was probably unhappy when I suggested and provided the transcripts in my book that suggested he had misrepresented the nature of my contributions to political campaigns. I went back and looked at that, and there's direct quotes. The Wall Street Journal, I'm told, was mad because I was effective. In fact, somebody told me that the real reason they're after you so hard is because you've been effective, which got me thinking that perhaps after this is all done and I have to go out and look for another job, maybe I'll write Fox News, maybe I'll write the Wall Street Journal and ask them for a letter of recommendation on my effectiveness. And then I thought, actually, I've been reading a couple of biographies of Churchill, and one of the things that comes out in each one is the Wall Street Journal opinion page was wrong on World War II. The Wall Street Journal opinion page was wrong on Churchill's speech in Missouri about the Cold War and the Iron Curtain. It's very clear that the Wall Street Journal was wrong about Iraq. They're wrong on Wilson and his wife, so I'm not sure that they would be very good as a reference. But the reason this smear campaign has been run by the Republican National Committee. They have directed this. They have sent, during the height of it, 3 blast faxes out a day. I actually got a couple. The 3 days, this is going to go on another minute or two. The 3 days that we were in Boston, they opened up their press conference by saying, well, we've discredited and trashed Wilson and his wife. Why is anybody listening to him? Now, the head of the Republican Party is the President of the United States, ably assisted by his vice president and by his political advisor. There is a criminal investigation going on involving the White House in the betrayal of the national security of this country. The President of the United States has sought criminal defense counsel. The Vice President has counsel. Mr. Rove has counsel. They have either appeared before the special counsel or they have appeared before the grand jury. I am not a lawyer, but my understanding is that there are ethical considerations surrounding whether or not you are actively engaged in tampering with an ongoing criminal investigation if you might be party to that criminal investigation. And yet, they're directing this campaign. And the reason was clear in the Wall Street Journal opinion piece. They want Mr. Fitzgerald to, quote, fold up his tent. Now, there's a second reason for the timing of this, I'm absolutely convinced, is that it was a dress rehearsal for the Swift Boat Veterans Slam. They were able to tweak it. They were able to see how they could manipulate the press, get the facts out, and do this before they came on with the onslaught on John Kerry. But there is a third reason, which is perhaps more ominous. And that reason is to send a signal to the American people. And the signal is as follows. Should a citizen exercise his civic duty to call his government to account for what his government says and does in the name of the American people, as I did, then this administration's response will be to use every political weapon in its arsenal to destroy that citizen and his family. Be afraid, be very, very afraid. Now, that is un-American. It is undemocratic. It is inconsistent with the social contract bequeathed to us by our founding fathers, who said at the very beginning, we must have a healthy suspicion of the power of the executive branch. Hence, we will create co-equal branches of government, and we will endow the press, and we will endow the citizenry with absolute freedoms and responsibilities, essentially, to hold the government to account. And that's what we must do. As I've been traveling around the country over the past several months, a couple of terms keep coming up. One is the whiff of fascism, generally from people who grew up in Central Europe in the 30s, who tell me, beware, you will not know it has happened until it is too late. And secondly is a reference to the McCarthy era from people who grew up a little bit later. Now, the good news about America is that we have a long history of resisting this type, the pendulum swinging this far in one direction. We have resisted before, and we must continue to resist. It is in the nature of our social contract to do so. It is time for somebody to stand up and say, have you no shame? Thank you very much.
Thank you, panelists all, for your great talks. And thank you, audience, for your great questions. About 50 came forward. Let me say, just statistically, 6 of the 50 were about Florida and vote count, betraying an understandable anxiety. And I ignored, though, all the questions about why isn't John Kerry doing A, B, and C, because this actually is about the Bush record, not the politics of 04, although apparently not a lot of Republican delegates have come downtown and are in this audience based on the questions and your applause. Let me just ask questions as I determined they were useful of the panelists that they were directed to. First, a policy question for Paul. So what do the Democrats plan to do on the economy that would actually be different and better?
Okay.
In 700 words.
That's a discipline I think I've learned. Yeah, the core, just let's talk first about what's actually in the Kerry proposals. The core of it, the central proposal is to roll back the champagne portion of the Bush tax cuts and use the money for health care and a little bit for education. And it's, that's big stuff. Actually, in a way, if we ever come out the other end, Bush may have done us in a peculiar way a favor by throwing all these vast sums at unjustified tax cuts for people who don't need them. He's made it clear how relatively cheap really big things that will do a lot of social good are. The Kerry plan is about $60 billion a year, which really takes care of close to 2/3 of the people who now don't have health insurance. I'd go for the full $100 billion a year that covers everybody, but compared with the $270 billion in lost revenue this year from the Bush tax cuts, you suddenly realize that, hey, getting everybody health insurance is not so hard to do. That's the biggest thing. The other thing in the Kerry plan, which is rationalization and enforcement of corporate taxation, which would do some good things for jobs and is just, is again, actually taking money that we need for programs we need from the right people. The bigger thing, and I think this is, you can't point to the specifics, but we're talking about actual responsible people making economic policy. What can I say? Robert Rubin, Jon Snow. What more do you have to say about the whole thing?
Thank you. A question from a Matt Harwood, the Washington Monthly, addressed to Joe Wilson. How can U.S. foreign policy effectively fight Islamic fundamentalism and promote democratization without resorting to military intervention and occupation?
Well, I try and put out in the book. I try and compare and contrast the way that we did the end of the Cold War, the end game of the Cold War. And the argument that I made in the book and the argument that I would make here is that if you understand the traditional use of the military, which is to defend the United States against imminent threats to us, not to go adventuring, and if you understand also that we historically have had a fairly sophisticated toolbox of other foreign policy tools at our disposal, a lot of which we used in the latter stages of the Cold War, but which would include everything from incentives such as the opening of American markets to foreign exports to deterrence, such as robust diplomacy, such as economic sanctions, such as international sanctions, such as, in fact, going as far as subversion and other tools, if you really felt that you had to do so because your concern was so great about the nature of the direction. Things that we've done in the past, things that American governments have been castigated for having done in the past. My point in all of this is that the use of the military in an aggressive way has unintended consequences that we're now beginning to see. In the case of Iraq, for example, we're close to 1,000 Americans dead. We're up to $150 billion spent, and our international reputation is in tatters. Dick Cheney said that 20,000 terrorists have been trained in al-Qaeda camps. And if you assume a ratio of, say, 100 to 1 or even 1,000 to 1 of sympathizers and supporters to actual terrorists who would kill you, that gives you an overall population who before 9/11 hated us enough to either sympathize, support, or try and kill Americans of the order of 2 million or maybe 20 million. Now with U.S., the respect for the United States below the statistical margin of error in a number of Arab countries, which number in the Islamic world 1 billion people, in the Arab world well over 400 million people, many of whom are underemployed 19-year-old Arab males, you can see the extent to which this potential population that poses a threat to our national security has grown exponentially or will grow exponentially. And so you have to ask yourself the question whether or not use of military in this action when there was not an imminent threat, where there was not a grave and gathering danger, has not had the ultimate unintended consequences that you wanted to avoid, which is greater threat to American citizens, which we constitute our military to defend us against. So my argument really is and always has been that there is a whole vast array of tools at our disposal. Many of them have been weakened over the years as American diplomacy has been under attack from a number of different quarters in the American political process. But I certainly don't think that resorting to military action in wars of choice is either going to yield the desired result, and we've seen the limits of our ability in this regard in imposing democracy in Iraq.
Thank you. Both questions were substantive about better economic policy, a better use of what Harvard's Joseph Nye calls soft power around the world. Let me say, in the book that's out there, What We Stand For, a program for progressive patriotism, 17 authors discuss issues just like this. Sandy Berger, President Clinton's national security advisor, has an essay on, in a sense, answering this question, Joe, where he uses the phrase that America is strongest not simply when we focus on the example of our force, but the force of our example. And we can persuade peoples not just by invading them, but the values that so many Americans, so many people around the world love. There's a question here for Sidney Blumenthal. It's long and very interesting. It's the morning of November 3rd. Whether because of Brother Jeb's valiant efforts in Florida or because of, this is not signed, by the way, or because of those clever new electronic voting machines with no paper ballots, George W. Bush has successfully stolen his second consecutive presidential election. What do you, Sidney, I don't want to ask this of everyone, think would be an appropriate response by citizens to this scenario?
It's good not to get a loaded hypothetical. This question is formulated on the fact that Florida was decided in 2000 by an unprecedented intervention of the Supreme Court, 5-4, in which it decided that the votes would not be counted in Florida. And they were not counted. And so the question is, there'll be many scenarios if something strange like that happens. The scenarios should involve legal action. And the question is, what happens as a result of the legal action, and does the Supreme Court act again? But these are all very, very hypothetical. What's real is that the Republican Party conducts campaigns of voter suppression. We conduct GOTV, get out the vote. They try and get out their base, and they try and suppress our voters. They try and, in particular, intimidate minorities. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court began his political career on the streets of Arizona, trying to prevent and intimidate minority voters from voting. William Rehnquist. We will see those campaigns again. We need a lot of people out there monitoring these campaigns, and we need to get out every single voter we can and get everybody to the polls so that this scenario never happens.
For Craig Unger, why do commentators and reporters insist on representing the Saudi-Bush critique in your book and that in Fahrenheit 9/11 as, quote, conspiracy theory, close quote?
Well, conspiratorialist is really replaced red baiting, and that is the line of attack I've been getting for over 10 years. There really is no conspiracy if you read my book. They have had this long relationship, the Bush and the Saudis. No one really disputes that. No one disputes the amount of money that has changed hands. No one disputes now that the planes actually left. It was quite interesting, actually. The White House denied that these evacuation planes with the Saudis on them left for 2 full years. The FBI denied it for 2 full years. The FAA denied it for 2 full years. And what was extraordinary too, now they'd say they all left, but they've changed the story and said, well, it's okay, restrictions had been lifted. What they omit again and again is that restrictions were in place for private planes. And you see this kind of attack from the right again and again, that people like me are called conspiracy nuts. And there seems to be a zone of comfort about what's acceptable to write about in the mainstream press. When I decided to go ahead with this book, I was looking for material that I knew would be acceptable to mainstream journalists, and I found one kernel of it in a piece that had been published in the Wall Street Journal in 1991, and it showed how the Saudis had bailed out George W. Bush when he was at Harkin Energy back in 1991 when his father was president. And it was a terrific piece of journalism. It was done by 3 reporters for the Wall Street Journal. One of them was Jill Abramson, who's now managing editor of the New York Times. And as I started the whole project, I said, well, if she knows about this, the Times knows about it. And yet I knew in the end the Times would not touch the story, and they didn't. And the only thing that's changed is George W. Bush is no longer the president's son, he's the president, and the Saudis who bailed him out have been tied. There have been allegations that they were behind Islamist charities that funded terrorism. Yet no one in the American press would touch it. And you've seen that again and again. And I think one reason reporters shy away from it, and there are many reasons, I think reporters are addicted to access. They will be denied access if they ask the tough questions. It's about careerism, opportunism, and so on. And they don't want to, and if they're called a conspiracy nut, it hurts their careers.
There's a question of me, quote, if a majority of Americans agree with progressives on issues, Why do they lose national elections? Close quote. I guess I could add, or mayoral elections. First, at the risk of being self-critical, self-analytic, Robert Frost is reported to have once said that a liberal is someone who won't take his own side in a debate, and which is a perversion of a definition of a liberal, which is someone who's tolerant. But in the era of Limbaugh and Hannity and Foxed or outfoxed, I see progressives now as pushing back real hard. Hence Air America, hence Begala and Carville on Crossfire. And the era of on this hand, on the other hand, and you have a very fine point there, Mr. Limbaugh, is over. Second, Republicans for generations, to be blunt, have often run occasionally successfully for president against the Reds and the Blacks. Willie Horton, the implication that Democrats are soft on defense after having successfully prosecuted World War I, World War II, and the suppression of African-American voters in Florida, not Hispanic voters, because they are split politically, but the two large felony lists disqualifying you from voting in Florida are disproportionately overrepresented by African-American people rather than Hispanics in Florida for political reasons. And so that is not pretty, but it has occasionally worked, as the answer to one of the prior questions indicates. Third, Sidney spoke very well to this, and Joe has lived it. It was once said by Mark Twain that a lie gets halfway around the world before truth puts on her boots. And I got to tell you, having been in a campaign, sometimes when someone says something about you that is the opposite of the truth, I won't give current examples in the presidential race, but they come to mind. It is very difficult to figure out whether to respond, elevate, and publicize the slander, or whether you just try to have surrogates do it or ignore it. It is just not easy. Machiavelli once wrote that the greatest tactic is to go after not an opponent's weakness, but his strength, to undermine what people otherwise think about him. And so the slanders too often work. Finally, and the real answer to this is, all data show that on issue after issue, the public is in favor of stronger environmental law enforcement, even if it leads to increased costs of products, in favor of teachers getting more and there being smaller class sizes, in favor of a more universal health care plan, whether it's based on Israel's or Canada's. And so the challenge to progressive candidates, whether for president or anything, is to be able to cogently and persuasively argue why covering your child's health care, shrinking his or her class size, cleaning the air, and working with allies is more in your interest than two lesbians marrying in Vermont. And I am midway through a book that's on the Times bestseller list, What's the Matter with Kansas, where the author explains how Kansas is so economically impoverished, and a century ago it would have led to a populist revolt. It did lead to a populist revolt, but now they are being, said the author, successfully misled into thinking that certain wedge cultural issues are more important than their pocketbook issues. And it's up to progressives to win the public argument, despite the slanders and despite the misleading comments, on why economic pocketbook issues mean that one party is factually superior to the other. Let me just say that I looked at the New Democracy Project, looked at gross domestic product and real growth rates in GDP each year since Roosevelt was first elected. Before then, the data was wild because of the Depression. If you add up all the growth rates under Democratic presidents and Republican presidents, which is a fact, growth rates under Democratic progressive presidents is 2 to 3 times, I don't mean 2% more, 20% more, but 200 to 300% more than under Republican presidents. The next question, back to Paul Krugman. Mr. Krugman, obviously they're not a student of yours, Princeton. But Professor Krugman, you've intimated that if Bush loses in November, a lot of, quote, dirty laundry, unquote, may get out and bring legal problems for members of the administration. Well, can you elaborate now?
Okay. Let me say, legal, I'm not sure. But I think there's the revelations. Look, what are the things that we know are much worse than has made it out? The Wilson plane affair, surely. The cooking of intelligence. We know with fair certainty that there was intense pressure put on analysts to cook the case for war. Contracting in Iraq. There are billions and billions of unaccounted for dollars. With stonewalling. You know, there are internal audits that the Defense Department and the Coalition Provisional Authority have refused to release. We can guess why. The Cheney Energy Task Force. There has to be some reason why they're blocking it. You know, let's think about the fact that it took a couple of years of lawsuits and one very enterprising tiny utility in the Northwest to get the tapes, the control room tapes that revealed Enron traders telling power plants to shut down to drive up the price when the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission was in possession of those tapes all that time, that they were just sitting on it. So how many more things are there like that? I'm sure I'm missing a bunch, but there's no question in my mind that Abu Ghraib, sorry. Again, everything we know is that not only that there are pictures, in fact, of things much worse than anything that you've seen. Legal action, I'm not sure. I think that the point is getting the stuff out into the light of day, that the psychological impact, I hope, of the revelation of what has been done in our name would be enormous. And let me say, actually, I think that fear of this is one of the reasons. They probably didn't need extra incentive to wage a particularly dirty campaign, but this is one of the reasons. If someone asks you what did John Kerry do in the Senate, he more or less single-handedly brought down BCCI. And don't forget that story. And it must be a real nightmare to think of him in this position of being able to remove the shroud of secrecy. So that's the story.
Thank you. Let me ask a question. Generally, any panelist can feel free to answer. What do you think is the biggest hypocrisy in George Bush Jr.'s, George W. Bush's tenure as president in his 2000 campaign and/or in the present campaign?
Oh boy.
I didn't write this to prove it. David Calamaneri of Hoboken, New Jersey. David.
Well, let me.
It's a tough question to answer.
Let me
like the donkey starving between two carrots.
As a candidate for president in the year 2000, President Bush gave his foreign policy speech at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley. And that speech was characterized by a commitment to humility, a commitment to moderate policy objectives within the context of alliances with friends, a commitment to internationalism, and a commitment to proposing rather than imposing. And I think, of course, the record has been sharply different, and it is now clear. It was clear to some of us then by just the people that were advising him that the operating blueprint for the policy was not going to be the Bush speech, but it was going to be the project for the new American century, which was sold to the administration as a reasoned policy document. Which would guarantee our own national security for the next 75 years, as well as the national security of our close friends and allies through the aggressive use of military force to defeat and deter real and imagined enemies. Of course, the reality, when this thesis met the harsh reality of the road of Iraq, it exposed, first of all, the weakness in our ability to manage things like occupations militarily, And secondly, I think it exposed the whole underlying premise behind the project of the New American Century as a series of ideological assertions with no grounding in history, geography, understanding of international relations, or understanding of that most basic Churchillian principle that in addition to being strong, if you hope to succeed in your foreign policy objectives, you needed to understand and address the legitimate grievances of your enemies and your potential enemies.
I want to mark if, go ahead. Similarly, on the domestic front, in 2000, Bush campaigned famously as a compassionate conservative. And the last convention we saw, just as this one, will depict him as such. And yet, this time, he has a record that belies that slogan. His education program, Leave No Child Behind, is crushing public education. Today, the New York Times had a story about how children with disabilities have been left behind systematically. His Medicare reform is intended to begin the privatization of the Medicare system and throw seniors who can't afford it out. It was achieved in the dark of night in the floor of the House of Representatives by Tom DeLay, the majority leader, holding open the rule for hours in order to coerce moderate Republicans who knew better. The actuary who had the figure which showed that it would cost much more than the Bush administration had said was told that he would be fired, his career ended, if he told the truth. We have also learned that the result of compassionate conservatism has been an increase of 1.3 million people in poverty. Much of this was supposed to be resolved through faith-based programs. The first person who was head of the faith-based office in the Bush White House was an earnest and honest academic named John DiIulio, who was the first to leave in disillusionment and said that there was no serious discussion of social or domestic policy going on in the White House, and that the entire operation was run by what he called the Mayberry Machiavellis. He meant Karl Rove. And now we see what the faith-based program is really about, with the reports that what Bush is doing through the Bush-Cheney campaign is setting up political coordinators in every church that they can, using the churches as though they were little Tammany halls. So that is the result of compassionate conservatism, and there's something to keep in mind as we watch the show on TV this week.
I want to say something on this.
Paul?
Just an observation, and I think part of the deep mystery, something I don't fully understand, but I think what's really striking beyond the hypocrisy in the policies is the pervasive personal hypocrisy that is just. Here's the way I think about it. If I were writing a really bad political novel, a real potboiler, I would. You'd have the villains of it be, not just wrong, but grossly, transparently hypocritical. So you'd have all of the people who pretended to be big patriots would be people who had ducked service, men who had never taken a risk or made a sacrifice for their country. That all of the people who talked about free markets and private initiative would be people who grew wealthy through crony capitalism and deals and political influence. And then just to cap it off, you'd insert some comical figures, like someone who preached morality and wrote books like the Book of Virtues, who turned out to have a gambling habit and lie about it. And it is, there's something deeply amazing about it. And look, and this is a mystery. Actually, it's something that we do have to figure out why it doesn't, these things don't have more traction. You know, when people say, getting back to, John Kerry brought the Swift boat thing on by himself, by talking about his genuine heroism in the war. I thought that Operation Flight Suit made the Texas Air National Guard fair game, but everyone treated it as if it was not. And I don't quite understand, but it's sort of, the hypocrisy is, aside from the policy, just the sheer hypocrisy is astonishing.
With that, I want to conclude in the interest of time and getting you all to get home tonight to watch the convention on television. What happened tonight were people who are opinionated but factual. And having come personally through a exciting crossfire experience last week on CNN, so often when you have a couple of seconds to outshout someone based on a selective fact, it doesn't yield the kind of policy exchanges that we did here tonight, and I'd love to do with the other side. Anybody here who would like to find out more about any of our books or the books of our colleagues and panelists here, you can go to www.newdemocracyproject.org, which organized this with the People for the American Way and True Majority and The Nation magazine and the Progressive Book Club. I'm really honored that you all came out tonight, and especially honored that a panel of this quality has joined us and shared with us. Please thank them. Thank you. Thank you.